The torchlight flickered against the packed earth, casting dancing shadows across the circle of wolves. My heart hammered against my ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. This was it. The night every she-wolf dreamed of. The mate ceremony. All around me, my pack stood in reverent silence. Their faces glowed with excitement and anticipation. Fathers placed protective hands on their daughters' shoulders. Mothers wiped away proud tears. For them, this night was a celebration of destiny, of sacred bonds blessed by the moon goddess herself. For me, it was my last hope. I was Kayla. An Omega. The lowest rank in our rigid hierarchy. While other she-wolves trained in combat and pack politics, I spent my days tending the wounded and sensing the emotional storms that raged beneath calm surfaces. I could feel a mother's hidden grief like a stone in my chest. A warrior's secret fear tasted like copper on my tongue. Most unsettling of all, I could soothe pain with nothing more than a gentle touch. My father called it a worthless gift. She-wolves need strength, not feelings, he would growl, his disappointment rolling off him in waves that made my stomach clench. What good is an Omega who can barely shift? But tonight, none of that would matter. The moon goddess would reveal my perfect match. My fated mate. Someone whose soul was crafted to complement mine. Someone who would look at me and see not a weak Omega, but their destined partner. Alpha Marcus, a mountain of a man with a voice like rolling thunder, raised his hands for silence. The crowd stilled, even the children sensing the sacred weight of the moment. Let the bonds be revealed, he commanded. I closed my eyes and sent a desperate prayer to the silver moon above. Please. Please let him be kind. Please let him see me. The pull came like lightning through my veins, sudden, electric, undeniable. An invisible cord wrapped around my heart and tugged with gentle insistence. My eyes flew open, and my feet began moving without conscious thought. Gasps and whispers followed in my wake as I walked across the ceremonial circle, drawn by a force older than words. The invisible thread led me past seasoned warriors, past eligible betas, straight to the center of our pack's elite. It pulled me to a stop directly in front of the most magnificent man I had ever seen. Beta Lysander. My heart soared into the starlit sky. It was him. Lysander, with his golden hair catching the torchlight and his broad shoulders speaking of countless victories. He was everything an Omega could dream of, strong, respected, admired by all. The pack's finest warrior, second only to the Alpha himself. I looked up into his storm-gray eyes, a trembling smile blooming across my lips. This was my new beginning. My chance at happiness. The smile died on my face like a flame in winter wind. Lysander wasn't smiling. He was staring down at me with an expression of pure horror, as if I were something foul he discovered on the bottom of his boot. His face had gone pale, his jaw working soundlessly as he processed the cosmic joke that had just been played on him. He took a sharp step backward, the movement so violent it might as well have been a physical blow. No. The single word cracked like a whip in the sacred silence. This is impossible. This has to be a mistake. Alpha Marcus stepped forward, his brow furrowed in confusion. Lysander? The bond has chosen. What is the meaning of this? Lysander found his voice then, and when he spoke, each word was a dagger aimed straight at my heart. I will not be bound to this. He pointed at me as if I were diseased. Look at her. She's weak, pathetic, useless. She can barely shift into her wolf form. She has no strength, no fighting skills, no value to this pack whatsoever. The crowd began to murmur, heads nodding in agreement. They looked at me with the same disgust now painting Lysander's features. I felt their judgment like acid on my skin. She is nothing. Lysander's voice rose, carrying to every corner of the gathering. I am Beta of this pack. I deserve a mate worthy of that title, not some broken Omega who cries at the sight of blood. Tears blurred my vision, but I couldn't look away from his face. This was my fated mate. The other half of my soul. And he was rejecting me with a cruelty that stole my breath. Lysander, Alpha Marcus began, but my mate cut him off. I, Beta Lysander of the Silver Mane Pack, reject you, Kayla the Omega, as my mate. I sever this bond by my own free will. The formal words of rejection hit me like physical blows. You are not worthy of me. The mate bond, which had felt like warm honey in my veins moments before, snapped with an audible crack that echoed inside my skull. The pain was indescribable, like someone had reached into my chest and torn away a vital organ. I doubled over, gasping, as agony unlike anything I'd ever known ripped through my body. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the devastation in my heart. I looked desperately toward my family, seeking even a crumb of support or comfort. My parents stood at the edge of the circle, and when my tear-filled eyes found theirs, they looked away. My father's face was stone. My mother's cheeks burned with shame, not for my treatment, but for my existence. They were ashamed of me. Alpha Marcus cleared his throat, his expression unreadable as he surveyed the scene. Then I noticed the man beside him, a stranger I'd never seen before. He wore fine traveling clothes marked with a silver wolf pin, the symbol of the royal court. His cold eyes assessed me like I was livestock at market. Well, the Alpha said to the stranger, his voice carrying easily across the silent crowd, it seems we have resolved our situation. The agreed upon terms still stand. The item is yours, as promised. Item? My blood turned to ice water in my veins. The stranger nodded, his expression calculating. The price remains acceptable, despite the complications. They weren't just rejecting me. They were selling me. Before I could fully process this betrayal, two of our pack's warriors stepped forward and seized my arms. Their grips were iron bands, crushing and impersonal. Wait! I cried out, struggling against their hold. Father! Please! Don't do this. My father finally looked at me then, and what I saw in his eyes nearly stopped my heart. There was no love there. No regret. Only relief, the same relief someone might feel when finally disposing of spoiled meat. It's for the best, Kayla, he said, his voice flat and emotionless. You don't belong here. You never did. The warriors dragged me toward a dark carriage waiting at the edge of our territory. Every step away from my pack felt like another small death. I looked back over my shoulder one final time, taking in the faces of wolves I'd known my entire life. Not one showed sympathy. Not one called out in protest. They watched me being hauled away like discarded trash, and they felt nothing. The carriage door slammed shut behind me with a finality that echoed in my bones. Through the barred window, I heard Alpha Marcus's voice one last time, clear and satisfied. A most satisfactory transaction. Damaged goods, but the price was fair. As the carriage lurched into motion, carrying me away from everything I'd ever known, I didn't cry. I was beyond tears now. I simply sat in the darkness and let the truth settle into my soul like poison. I was nothing. I was no one. I was damaged goods sold to settle a debt. The girl who had walked into that ceremonial circle full of hope and dreams was dead. What remained was just broken pieces rattling around in a shell that looked like her. Chapter 2, The Citadel of Shadows. The journey lasted 3 endless days and nights. I sat in the narrow carriage, my body growing stiff from the hard wooden seat, watching the landscape change from familiar forests to towering mountain peaks. The royal envoy never spoke to me. I was cargo, nothing more, nothing less. The higher we climbed into the mountains, the thinner the air became and the colder the wind that whistled through the carriage's cracks. By the 3rd day, my breath came out in visible puffs, and I wrapped my arms around myself for warmth that never came. When the carriage finally slowed, the sound of wheels changed from dirt road to cobblestones. We had arrived. The door opened abruptly, and harsh sunlight made me squint. The envoy gestured impatiently for me to exit. Out, he commanded, his voice bored and businesslike. I stumbled from the carriage on legs that barely supported me. The mountain air was so thin it burned my lungs, and I found myself standing before the most imposing structure I had ever seen. The king's citadel rose from the mountain itself like a dark growth of stone and iron. Massive towers clawed at the sky, disappearing into low-hanging clouds. The walls were built from blocks of black granite that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. It should have been magnificent. Instead, it felt like standing before the gates of a prison. But it was the feeling that truly made my knees weak. The moment I crossed the threshold, a wave of crushing despair hit me like a physical force. It pressed down on my shoulders, making each breath an effort. The sadness was so thick I could taste it, metallic and bitter on my tongue. It wasn't my own emotion, it was seeping from the very stones of this place. Something was very, very wrong here. Servants moved through the courtyard like ghosts. Their faces were pale and drawn, their eyes darting nervously as if expecting attack at any moment. Guards stood at rigid attention, but I could feel their fear radiating from them in waves that made my stomach churn. No one spoke above a whisper. No one smiled. An older woman with steel-gray hair pulled into a severe bun approached us. Her face could have been carved from the same granite as the walls, hard, cold, and unforgiving. She looked me up and down with obvious disdain. "This is the offering?" she asked the envoy, her voice sharp with criticism. He nodded curtly. "As arranged." "She's yours now, Bertie." Without another word, without even a farewell, the envoy turned and walked away. Just like that, the last connection to my old life was severed. The woman, Bertie, studied me with calculating eyes. "Follow me," she ordered. "Touch nothing. Speak to no one. Keep your head down and your mouth shut." She led me not through the grand entrance I could see in the distance, but through a narrow servant's door set into the side of the massive structure. The corridors beyond were dim and oppressive, lit by guttering torches that cast dancing shadows on the stone walls. Our footsteps echoed hollowly in the gloom. We descended a steep staircase that led deep into the bowels of the citadel. The air grew colder with each step, carrying the scent of old stone and something else I couldn't identify, something that made my skin crawl. "These are the servants' quarters," Bertie announced, stopping before a wooden door that looked like all the others lining the narrow hallway. She pushed it open to reveal a space barely larger than a closet. A narrow cot, a thin blanket, and a chamber pot were the only furnishings. There was no window, no source of warmth beyond body heat. "This is your room," she continued briskly. "You will sleep here when not on duty. You will keep it clean. You will not bring anything into it that doesn't belong to you, which is nothing." I nodded numbly, too overwhelmed to speak. Her cold eyes fixed on mine, and I saw something that might have been pity flicker there for just an instant before disappearing. "Your duties are simple but critical. Every evening at sunset, you will report to the king's private chambers. You will remain there until dawn. You will not speak unless spoken to. You will not make noise. You will not attempt to leave. My blood turned to ice. The king's chambers. At night. Alone. Everyone knew the stories about King Theron. He was called the Shadow King, the Broken Crown, the Mad Monarch. Some said his cruelty knew no bounds. Others whispered that he had been cursed by dark magic. All agreed on one thing: he was dangerous. What? I swallowed hard, my voice coming out as barely a whisper. What does he want with me? Bertie's expression hardened. You do not ask questions. You do not wonder. You obey. That is how you survive in this place. She leaned closer, and I caught the scent of fear beneath her stern facade. The king's needs are not for you to understand, girl. Your job is to fulfill them. Nothing more. She pressed a bundle of gray servant's clothes into my arms. The fabric was coarse and scratchy against my skin. Change into these. Then find me in the kitchens. You have work to do before tonight. She left me alone in the tiny cell that was now my home. I sat on the edge of the narrow cot and stared at the gray uniform in my hands. The reality of my situation settled around me like a burial shroud. I had been sold into sexual slavery. The rest of the day passed in a haze of backbreaking labor. I scrubbed stone floors until my knees bled and my fingertips were raw. I hauled buckets of water that made my back ache and my arms shake. Not one of the other servants spoke to me beyond curt orders. When they looked at me at all, their eyes held a mixture of pity and fear, as if I were already dead and just didn't know it yet. The oppressive sadness that permeated the citadel pressed down on me with every breath. I could feel it seeping into my bones, into my soul. The other servants called it the sorrowing, a mysterious affliction that had been growing stronger over the past few years. It made people weep for no reason, filled them with rage that had no target, drove them to despair so deep some never emerged. But to me, it felt like more than a disease. It felt like a curse. As the sun began its descent behind the mountain peaks, my time of reckoning arrived. Bertie found me in the scullery, my hands cracked and bleeding from lye soap. It is time, she said simply. Two massive guards appeared as if summoned by magic. They were both easily twice my size, with faces like granite and eyes that held no warmth. Without a word, they flanked me and began walking. I had no choice but to follow. We walked through corridors I hadn't seen before, grander ones with tapestries and polished floors. The sorrowing grew stronger with each step, pressing against my mind like a physical weight. By the time we stopped before an enormous oak door banded with iron, I could barely breathe. One of the guards looked at me, and for just a moment, his professional mask slipped. What I saw underneath made my stomach drop to my feet: pity. He looked at me the way someone might look at a lamb being led to slaughter. The door opened with a groan that echoed through the stone corridors. One guard placed a heavy hand on my back and pushed me forward into the darkness beyond. The door slammed shut behind me. The sound of the lock turning was as final as a coffin lid closing. I stood in the pitch-black room, my heart hammering so hard I was sure it would burst. The air was thick with that crushing sadness, but underneath it was something else, something that made every instinct I possessed scream at me to run. Then I heard it. It wasn't the roar of an angry beast or the cold laughter of a sadistic king. It was something infinitely worse. It was the sound of a man weeping. Not quiet tears, but raw, agonized sobs that seemed to tear themselves from his throat. They were the sounds of someone whose soul was being slowly shredded, whose heart was breaking over and over again with each breath. The sobs were coming from somewhere deeper in the room. Near what I could now see was a massive fireplace with dying embers. And despite every rational thought in my head, despite every warning Bertie had given me, I found myself taking a step forward. Then another. The king of the realm was not a monster. He was a man in agony. Chapter 3: The Broken King. I stood frozen in the doorway, my back pressed against the cold wood, listening to the most heartbreaking sound I had ever heard. The king's sobs echoed through the vast chamber, raw and desperate, like a soul being torn apart piece by piece. My eyes slowly adjusted to the dim light cast by the dying fire. The room was enormous, with vaulted ceilings that disappeared into shadow and furnishings that spoke of wealth beyond imagination. But all of that faded into insignificance compared to the figure collapsed near the hearth. King Theron knelt on the stone floor, his powerful frame shaking with the force of his grief. His dark hair hung in disheveled strands around his face, and his broad shoulders that should have carried a crown with pride, were bent under some invisible weight. He looked nothing like the terrifying monarch I had expected. He looked broken. The crushing sadness that filled the citadel was strongest here, radiating from him like heat from a forge. But now I could feel something more beneath it, a loneliness so profound it made my chest ache, a despair so complete it seemed to leach the warmth from the air itself. My empathic gift, the ability that had made me an outcast in my pack, stirred to life. I could feel his emotions as clearly as if they were my own, the weight of a crown that felt too heavy to bear, the constant pressure of decisions that affected thousands of lives, the crushing isolation of being the most powerful person in the realm and having no one who truly understood. I didn't decide to move. My feet simply carried me forward, one silent step at a time. The emotional storm surrounding him grew stronger with each step, buffeting me like a physical wind. I saw flashes of images in my mind, his memories bleeding through the connection, a young boy watching his father die, the weight of a crown placed on his head before he was ready, the faces of advisors who feared him more than they respected him, the endless parade of people who wanted something from him but never truly saw him. I was 3 steps away when the true horror of his condition became clear. This wasn't just sadness. This wasn't simply the weight of kingship. King Theron was feeling every emotion from every person in his kingdom all at once, their fears, their anger, their despair, their pain. It was all flooding into his mind in an endless torrent that never stopped, never gave him peace, never let him simply exist as himself. The realization stole my breath. How was he still sane? How had he not completely shattered under such a burden? Without conscious thought, I sank to my knees behind him and reached out with a trembling hand. The moment my palm touched his back, several things happened at once. A shock of freezing cold shot up my arm, so intense I gasped aloud. The emotional chaos in his mind crashed into mine like a tidal wave. Thousands of voices, thousands of feelings, thousands of pieces of pain all screaming at once. For a moment, I thought my mind would snap under the pressure. But then something else happened. Something that had never occurred when I'd used my gift before. Instead of just feeling his pain, I began to pull it into myself. The cold spread through my body like ice water in my veins. Every fear from every citizen in the kingdom flowed into me. Every moment of despair, every flash of anger, every deep sadness, all of it poured from his tortured mind into mine. The weight of it was crushing, suffocating, unbearable. But as I took his pain, King Theron's sobbing stopped. The sudden silence was so profound it felt loud. His entire body went still beneath my hand, the terrible shaking finally ceasing. For the first time in what must have been years, the storm in his mind was calm. Slowly, carefully, as if afraid to break some fragile spell, he turned to look at me. His face was streaked with tears, his eyes red and swollen from weeping. But those eyes, a striking silver that seemed to catch what little light the dying fire provided, were clear. Focused. They looked at me with an expression of pure wonder, as if I were some mythical creature that had materialized from his desperate dreams. "What?" His voice was rough and broken from screaming, barely above a whisper. "What are you? What did you just do?" I was shaking violently now, the cold from his absorbed pain making my teeth chatter. But I managed to find my voice. "I'm sorry," I stammered, pulling my hand back. "I didn't mean to. I just felt your pain and You took it." His words were filled with awe. The noise in my head, the screaming, it's quiet. For the first time in years, it's quiet. His silver eyes searched my face desperately. How is that possible? I wrapped my arms around myself, trying to contain the shivers that racked my body. I've always been able to feel what others feel. My pack said it was a useless gift. Sometimes I can take pain away. But I've never felt anything like. I gestured helplessly, unable to find words for the magnitude of what I had just experienced. King Theron stared at me in silence for a long moment. Then, slowly, he reached out and touched my face. His fingers came away wet with tears I hadn't realized I was shedding. "You're crying," he said softly. "It's your pain," I whispered. "I'm carrying it now." Something shifted in his expression then. The wonder was replaced by something that looked almost like horror. "No," he said, his voice sharp with sudden urgency. "No, you can't, you don't understand what you've done to yourself." But it was too late. The cold was spreading through my entire body now, settling into my bones like a living thing. The emotional weight of an entire kingdom pressed down on my mind, threatening to crack it like an eggshell. I could feel myself starting to fracture under the pressure. "I need to." I tried to stand, but my legs wouldn't support me. The room began to spin, and I felt myself falling. Strong arms caught me before I hit the stone floor. King Theron gathered me against his chest, his warmth a shocking contrast to the ice in my veins. For the first time since I'd been sold, since I'd been rejected, since my world had crumbled around me, I felt safe. "What have I done?" he whispered, his voice thick with guilt. "What have I done to you?" I looked up into his face, seeing past the crown and the titles to the man beneath, a man who had been slowly drowning in an ocean of other people's pain until I had chosen to drown with him. "You didn't do anything," I managed through chattering teeth. "I chose this." His arms tightened around me, and I felt something I never expected to feel from the terrifying Shadow King: tenderness. "Why?" he asked. "Why would you choose to take on such pain for someone you don't even know?" I thought about his question as the cold continued to spread through my body, as the weight of a kingdom's suffering pressed against my mind. Why had I done it? Why had I reached out to comfort a stranger who could have struck me down without consequence? "Because," I whispered, my voice barely audible, "no one should have to carry it alone." Something broke in his expression then. The mask of the king crumbled completely, revealing the lonely, desperate man underneath. He pulled me closer, cradling me like something precious rather than the damaged goods I had been told I was. "I don't even know your name," he said softly. "Kayla," I breathed, feeling consciousness starting to slip away as the supernatural cold claimed me. "Kayla," he repeated, and somehow my name sounded different on his lips, not like the worthless thing my pack had made it, but like something valuable. Something cherished. As darkness closed around me, I felt him lift me in his arms. The last thing I heard before the cold pulled me under was his voice, soft and wondering. "What have you done, brave little Omega? What have you done?" Chapter 4: The Anchor's Burden. I woke to warmth. It was such an alien sensation that for a moment I couldn't place it. Soft fabric surrounded me, not the scratchy servant's blanket, but something that felt like silk against my skin. The surface beneath me was yielding and comfortable, nothing like the hard cot in my cell. My eyes fluttered open to find myself in the most beautiful room I had ever seen. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting everything in a golden glow. The walls were warm cream stone instead of cold gray, and tapestries depicting peaceful forest scenes added splashes of green and blue. I was lying in an enormous bed, buried under a mountain of furs and velvet coverlets that must have cost more than my entire pack's yearly earnings. For a moment, I wondered if I had died and somehow found my way to the moon goddess's realm. Then the memories crashed back. The king's chambers. His agonized weeping. The crushing weight of a kingdom's pain flowing into my body like ice water. I sat up quickly, too quickly, and immediately regretted it as the room spun around me. A deep, bone-aching cold still lingered in my core, though it was much better than it had been. How long had I been unconscious? The sound of the door opening made me freeze. King Theron entered, carrying a wooden tray, and when he saw I was awake, his entire face transformed with relief. He looked different in the daylight. The terrible tension that had carved lines around his eyes was gone. His face, while still serious, wasn't twisted with agony. His dark hair was clean and combed, and he wore simple clothes rather than royal regalia, a white shirt and dark trousers that made him look more like a man than a monarch. He was, I realized with a flutter in my chest, devastatingly handsome. "You're awake," he said, and his voice held the same wonder it had last night. He approached the bed slowly, as if afraid I might bolt. "How do you feel?" "Tired," I admitted, my voice coming out as a rasp. "Cold. But better." I looked around the luxurious room, confusion evident on my face. "Where am I?" "Guest chambers," he said simply, setting the tray on the bedside table. "I couldn't leave you in that cell. Not after what you did for me." The tray held more food than I usually saw in a week, fresh bread still warm from the ovens, creamy butter, honey that gleamed like amber, and a cup of tea that smelled of herbs and comfort. My stomach cramped with sudden, desperate hunger. "This is for me?" I asked, unable to believe it. His expression softened. "Eat. You need to regain your strength after what you sacrificed last night." I picked up a piece of the bread with shaking hands and took a small bite. The taste exploded across my tongue, rich, complex, perfect. I had to fight back tears at the simple kindness of it. King Theron pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down, watching me eat with an intensity that should have been uncomfortable but somehow wasn't. "Tell me about your gift," he said once I had taken the edge off my hunger. I set down the bread, suddenly self-conscious. "It's not much of a gift. My pack thought it was more of a curse." "Your pack was wrong." His voice carried the absolute certainty of a king accustomed to being obeyed. "What you did last night, what you can do, it's extraordinary." I looked down at my hands, still not quite believing his words. "I've always felt what others feel. When I was small, if another child was sad, would start crying without knowing why. If someone was angry, I would feel it like acid in my stomach. My parents thought I was just overly emotional. But you can do more than feel it. You can take it away." I nodded slowly. "Sometimes. With small hurts, small sadnesses. I could touch someone and pull their pain into myself. But never anything like." I gestured helplessly. "What you carry is beyond anything I've ever encountered." Theron leaned forward in his chair, his silver eyes intent on my face. "The affliction I bear, it's called the sorrowing. It began about 5 years ago, shortly after I took the throne. At first, it was just an unusual empathy with my subjects. I could sense their general mood, their contentment or unrest. He ran a hand through his dark hair, and I could see the weight of memory in his expression. But it grew stronger. More invasive. Now I feel every emotion from every person in my kingdom as if it were my own. Their fears keep me awake at night. Their anger burns in my chest. Their despair threatens to drag me into madness. The magnitude of his suffering hit me anew. No wonder the citadel felt so oppressive. Everyone was unconsciously feeding their king their negative emotions, and he had no way to shield himself from the constant assault. But you, he continued, his voice dropping to something like reverence, you can anchor me. You can pull that torrent of feeling away and give me peace. Do you understand what that means? I did understand, and the implications terrified me. It would kill me, I whispered. If I tried to carry all of that regularly, it would destroy my mind. I know. His admission was stark, honest. And I have no right to ask such a thing of you. You've already given me more than anyone ever has. He leaned back in his chair, conflict clear on his face. I should send you somewhere safe. Give you a cottage, a pension, let you live whatever life you choose. But? I prompted, sensing there was more. But my kingdom is dying, Kayla. The sorrowing isn't contained to just me anymore. It's spreading, affecting my people. They grow more violent, more desperate every day. Without some way to manage this curse, I fear civil war is inevitable. I stared at him, seeing not the powerful king but the exhausted man beneath. He was offering me freedom, true freedom, but he was also showing me the cost of that choice. Thousands would suffer if I walked away. If I stayed, I said carefully, if I agreed to help you, what would that look like? Hope flickered in his eyes, quickly suppressed. I don't know. We would have to experiment, find a way for you to take enough of the burden to give me clarity without destroying yourself in the process. The smart thing would be to accept his offer of freedom. I had already been rejected, sold, and nearly broken. Why would I voluntarily take on more pain? But as I looked into his silver eyes, I remembered the sound of his desperate weeping. I remembered the crushing loneliness that had radiated from him like heat from a forge. I thought about the frightened servants, the oppressive atmosphere that hung over the entire citadel like a shroud. Most of all, I remembered something my grandmother had told me long ago. Sometimes, little one, our greatest weakness becomes our greatest strength when we find the right person to share it with. I took a deep breath, knowing I was probably making the most foolish decision of my life. I'll stay, I said. I'll help you. The transformation in his face was immediate and breathtaking. Relief, gratitude, and something that looked dangerously like hope shone in his eyes. Are you certain? He asked. Once we begin, there may be no going back. The bond between an anchor and their king is not easily broken. I'm certain, I said, and surprised myself by meaning it. He stood and moved closer to the bed, his expression suddenly formal. Then I, King Theron of the Northern Realm, accept your service as my anchor. I vow to protect you, to provide for you, and to never take your sacrifice for granted. The words seemed to hang in the air between us, weighted with power and possibility. And I, Kayla. I paused, realizing I no longer had a pack name to claim. I, Kayla, accept the role of anchor. I vow to help you bear the burden of the sorrowing, to stand with you against the darkness, and to never abandon you to face it alone. Something shifted in the air as I spoke, as if the universe itself was listening to our exchange. A warmth spread through my chest, not the overwhelming heat of absorbed emotions, but something gentler. Something that felt like coming home. Now, Theron said, his voice soft but determined, Let's see if we can find a way to save a kingdom without destroying the most precious thing in it. As he reached for my hand, I felt that warmth in my chest grow stronger. For the first time since my rejection, since my sale, since my world had crumbled around me, I felt something I had thought lost forever. Purpose. Chapter 5, The Treasure Found. 3 days passed in a blur of experimentation and discovery. King Theron, he had asked me to call him simply Theron in private, had given me quarters in the royal wing, a suite of rooms more luxurious than anything I could have imagined. No more servants' cells. No more scrubbing floors until my hands bled. Instead, my days were filled with something I had never experienced: respect. Theron treated me not as a servant or a tool, but as a partner in solving the crisis that threatened his kingdom. We worked together to understand the limits of my abilities, to find ways I could ease his burden without destroying myself in the process. The first breakthrough came when we discovered I could absorb smaller amounts of the sorrowing throughout the day, rather than taking it all at once. Like bleeding off pressure from a dam before it burst, these smaller sessions kept him functional while preventing the crushing overload that had nearly broken me that first night. The second breakthrough was more personal. "You're different when you're not in pain," I observed as we sat in his private study, the fire crackling warmly in the hearth between us. The late afternoon sun streamed through tall windows, casting everything in golden light. Theron looked up from the book he was reading, and I caught my breath at the sight of him. Without the constant tension of agony etched into his features, he was breathtaking. His silver eyes held warmth instead of desperation, and when he smiled, a real, genuine smile, it transformed his entire face. "Different how?" he asked, setting the book aside and giving me his full attention. "Kinder. Gentler. You laugh now." I tucked my feet under myself in the comfortable chair he'd provided. "The servants aren't afraid of you anymore. They actually look you in the eye." It was true. The change in the Citadel's atmosphere over just 3 days had been remarkable. The oppressive weight of the sorrowing, while not gone, had lifted enough that people could breathe again. Servants hummed while they worked. Guards smiled at each other. Children's laughter could be heard echoing in the courtyards. "I had forgotten," Theron said softly, "what it felt like to simply exist without drowning in everyone else's emotions. You've given me back parts of myself I thought were lost forever." Heat bloomed in my cheeks at the intensity of his gaze. "I haven't done much. Just taken some of the pressure away. You've done everything." He rose from his chair and moved to the window, looking out over his kingdom with an expression of wonder. "For the first time in years, when I look at my lands, I see beauty instead of just the weight of responsibility. When I speak with my advisors, I can think clearly instead of being overwhelmed by their anxiety. When I eat, food has taste again." He turned back to me, and something in his expression made my heart race. "You've given me back my life, Kayla. How could that not change everything?" Before I could respond, a sharp knock interrupted us. Theron's expression shifted to mild annoyance at the intrusion. "Enter," he called. One of his advisors, a nervous man named Lord Garrett, hurried in with obvious urgency. "Your Majesty, forgive the interruption, but we have a situation. A delegation has arrived seeking audience. They say it's urgent, their pack is suffering from the sorrowing, and their alpha is too ill to lead." My stomach clenched with sudden dread. Theron noticed my reaction immediately, his attention shifting from the advisor to me with laser focus. "Which pack?" he asked, though his eyes never left my face. "The Silvermane pack, Your Majesty. Their leader is Beta Lysander." The name hit me like a physical blow. The book I had been holding slipped from numb fingers and hit the floor with a dull thud. The room seemed to spin around me, and I gripped the arms of my chair to keep from falling. Lysander. Here. The man who had rejected me so publicly, so cruelly. The mate who had looked at me with disgust and declared me worthless in front of our entire pack. The one who had stood by while I was sold like livestock. He was here, in the citadel where I had finally found peace. Kayla. Theron's voice was sharp with concern. He was beside my chair in an instant, kneeling so he could meet my eyes. What's wrong? You've gone pale. I couldn't speak. Could barely breathe. The old wounds I thought were healing tore open with renewed agony. Shame crashed over me in waves, not just at the memory of my rejection, but at the thought of Lysander seeing me here. What would he think? What would he say? Send them away, Theron said suddenly, his voice taking on the hard edge of absolute authority. Tell them the king is not available for audiences. Your Majesty. Lord Garrett looked confused. But their situation sounds dire. If the sorrowing is spreading to other territories. I said send them away. Theron's tone brooked no argument. Have them escorted back to the borders immediately. Wait. The word escaped me as barely a whisper, but it was enough to stop Lord Garrett in his tracks. I took a shaking breath, trying to find courage I wasn't sure I possessed. No. Don't send them away. Theron's eyes widened with surprise. Kayla, you don't have to. Yes, I do. I forced myself to stand on unsteady legs. If their pack is suffering from the sorrowing, then their people are in pain. Children might be having the nightmares. Mothers might be weeping for no reason they can understand. I met Theron's concerned gaze. I can't let my personal pain cause the suffering of innocence. You owe them nothing, Theron said fiercely. From what you've told me about your rejection. I owe myself something, I interrupted, surprising myself with the strength in my voice. I owe myself the chance to face them not as the broken, worthless Omega they threw away, but as the woman I've become. Theron studied my face for a long moment. I could see the conflict there, his desire to protect me warring with his respect for my choice. Finally, he nodded. If you're certain. But I want you to know that you face them not as their equal, but as their superior. You are my anchor, the second most powerful person in this kingdom. They will treat you with the respect you deserve, or they will answer to me. The transformation in his voice from gentle concern to regal authority sent shivers through me. This was the king others feared, the man who could command with a single word. And he was prepared to use that power to protect me. Lord Garrett, Theron continued without taking his eyes off me, have the delegation brought to the throne room in 1 hour. Make sure they understand they are here as supplicants, not honored guests. Yes, Your Majesty. The advisor bowed and hurried from the room. When we were alone again, Theron took my hands in his. Are you truly ready for this? I thought about the girl who had stood in that ceremonial circle, desperate for acceptance and love. I thought about the broken creature who had been dragged away in chains, sold like damaged goods. Then I looked around the beautiful room, at the man who held my hands like they were precious, at the reflection in the mirror that showed a woman in fine clothes with clear eyes and unbowed shoulders. Yes, I said, and meant it. I'm ready. An hour later, I stood beside Theron's throne in the great hall, my heart hammering against my ribs but my spine straight and proud. I wore a gown of deep blue silk that Theron had somehow procured, and my hair was arranged in an elegant style befitting a lady of the court. I looked nothing like the ragged Omega who had been cast out in shame. The massive doors at the far end of the hall groaned open, and 4 figures entered. Even at a distance, I recognized Lysander's confident stride, though something about his posture seemed different. Less arrogant. more weary. They approached the throne with the measured pace of those seeking favor, stopping at the appropriate distance before dropping to one knee in formal supplication. Lysander's golden hair caught the light from the high windows, and for a moment, my traitorous heart remembered why I had once thought him beautiful. "Your Majesty," Lysander said, his voice carrying easily through the vast hall. "I am Beta Lysander of the Silvermane Pack. I come before you in desperate need, seeking aid for my people who suffer greatly from the spreading curse." Theron let the silence stretch, his expression carved from stone. When he finally spoke, his voice held the full weight of royal authority. "Rise, Beta Lysander." They stood, and it was then that Lysander's eyes began to scan the throne room, taking in the banners, the guards, the evidence of royal power. His gaze moved past me at first, a mere courtier standing beside the throne, then snapped back with sudden, violent shock. I watched his face cycle through expressions, confusion, disbelief, and then dawning recognition. His mouth fell open, his eyes widened, and what little color he had drained from his cheeks completely. "Kayla?" My name escaped him as a strangled whisper. Theron's voice cut through the air like a blade. "You will address my anchor as Lady Kayla, and you will show her the respect due to her station." Lysander's eyes darted between Theron and me, his mind clearly reeling. "Your anchor?" "Indeed." Theron's tone was coldly pleasant. "Lady Kayla serves as my most trusted advisor and the key to managing the very affliction that brings you here as a supplicant. It seems the moon goddess has an interesting sense of irony. The Omega your pack deemed worthless enough to sell has become the most valuable person in my kingdom." The words hit their target with devastating accuracy. Lysander flinched as if physically struck, and I saw the exact moment the full weight of his mistake crashed down on him. The worthless Omega he had rejected with such public cruelty now stood at the right hand of the most powerful man in the realm. And he had come here to beg for her help. "Lady Kayla," he said, his voice hollow with shock. I don't understand. How is this possible?" I stepped forward, and was pleased to note my voice remained steady and clear. "Perhaps, Beta Lysander, you simply didn't look hard enough to see what was already there." The formal use of his title instead of his name was a deliberate choice, creating distance where once there had been the intimacy of fated mates. His face crumpled slightly at the coldness in my tone. "We will hear your petition," Theron announced. "But know that any aid rendered will be entirely at Lady Kayla's discretion. After all, why should she help those who cast her aside so callously?" As Lysander struggled to find words, I felt a surge of something I had never experienced before: power. Not the supernatural power of my abilities, but the simple, intoxicating power of being valued. Of being protected. Of being seen as precious by someone who mattered. For the first time since my rejection, I wasn't the one begging for scraps. I was the one who held all the cards. Chapter 6: The Past Returns. The throne room fell into tense silence as Lysander struggled to process what he was seeing. His companions, 3 other warriors from my former pack, looked equally stunned, their eyes darting between me and their beta with obvious confusion. I used the silence to study the man who had once been my fated mate. The months since my rejection had not been kind to him. His golden hair, once perfectly groomed, now hung limp and lifeless. Dark circles ringed his storm-gray eyes, and his face had a gaunt quality that spoke of sleepless nights and poor appetite. Most telling of all was the way he held himself. The confident arrogance that had once defined him was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like defeat. The mate bond, which had been severed so cruelly that night, still existed as a faint echo in my chest. It ached now, not with longing, but with a hollow sadness for what might have been in another lifetime. Your Majesty, Lysander finally found his voice, though it cracked slightly on the words. We came seeking aid for our pack. The sorrowing has spread to our territory. Our people suffer from violent mood swings, children wake screaming from nightmares, and our alpha has taken to his bed, too weak from despair to lead. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing with visible effort. We heard rumors that you had found some way to combat the curse. We hoped, we prayed that you might share your knowledge with us. Theron leaned forward slightly in his throne, his silver eyes cold as winter moonlight. And why should I help those who treat their own pack members as disposable commodities? The barb hit home. Lysander's face flushed red, and one of his companions, Marcus, I recognized him, shifted uncomfortably. Your Majesty, Marcus spoke up, with respect, what happened with Kayla was an internal pack matter. We seek aid for our people, not judgment for past decisions. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Theron's expression became positively glacial. An internal pack matter, he repeated, his voice deceptively soft. You sold a pack member, a woman, like chattel, and you dare call it an internal matter in my presence? She was rejected, Marcus said defensively, then seemed to realize his mistake as Theron's eyes flashed dangerously. I mean, the mate bond was severed. She had no place in our pack anymore. No place. Theron's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried clearly through the vast hall. Tell me, warrior, what do you think would happen to me if I declared my anchor to have no place in my kingdom? Marcus opened his mouth, then closed it, clearly realizing he was walking into a trap. My kingdom would fall within days, Theron continued, rising from his throne with fluid grace. The sorrowing would consume every soul within these borders. Chaos would reign. Thousands would die. He descended the steps slowly, each footfall echoing like a death knell. The woman you deemed worthless is literally the only thing standing between civilization and madness in the Northern Realm. He stopped directly in front of Marcus, and though the warrior was larger, he seemed to shrink under the king's attention. So tell me again how she had no place in your pack. Marcus said nothing, his face pale and his hands trembling slightly. Theron turned his attention back to Lysander. You came here seeking help, but you haven't answered my question. Why should I help those who harmed something precious to me? Lysander's eyes flicked to me, and I saw desperation there. Real, crushing desperation that made my empathic abilities sing with sympathetic pain. Because, he said, his voice breaking, innocent people are suffering. Children who had nothing to do with my mistakes. Mothers and fathers and grandparents who are being driven to madness by emotions they can't understand or control. His shoulders sagged with the weight of his words. I know what we did was wrong. I know that I made a terrible mistake. But please, don't let our people suffer for my failures. The raw honesty in his admission caught me off guard. This wasn't the arrogant Beta who had rejected me so callously. This was a broken man carrying the weight of his pack's suffering and his own crushing guilt. I felt Theron's eyes on me, waiting for my response. The decision was mine to make. I could refuse. I could let them return to their territory empty-handed, let them face the consequences of their cruelty. It would be justice of a sort, poetic revenge for the girl who had been cast aside like garbage. But as I looked at Lysander's haunted face, I remembered something else. I remembered the children in his pack, little ones who had sometimes smiled at me shyly when their parents weren't looking. I remembered old Sarah, who had always slipped me extra bread when I was hungry. I remembered young Thomas, barely 16, who had stammered through an apology the night of my rejection, the only one who had shown me any kindness. They didn't deserve to suffer for Lysander's choices. I will help, I said quietly. Hope flared in Lysander's eyes, bright and desperate. But, I continued, my voice growing stronger, not for you. I will help because innocent people are in pain, and I have the power to ease their suffering. That's what separates me from those who cast me aside. I don't let my personal pain override my compassion. Lysander flinched as if I'd slapped him, but he nodded. Of course. Whatever conditions you set, whatever price you ask, we'll pay it. There is no price, I said firmly. Healing isn't something you buy. It's something you give freely, or it has no power at all. I turned to Theron, who was watching me with an expression of profound admiration. I'll need supplies, herbs for calming drafts, crystals for focus, and a few days to prepare. The sorrowing that has infected their territory will require a different approach than what we've used here. Whatever you need, he said immediately. The royal stores are at your disposal. I looked back at Lysander and his companions. You'll be given quarters for the night. Tomorrow, I'll travel to your territory and do what I can to ease your people's suffering. You're coming with us? Lysander's voice held a mixture of hope and something that might have been longing. No, I said firmly. I'm going to help your pack. You'll return immediately and prepare your people for the healing ritual. I'll travel separately, with a royal escort befitting my station. The distinction was subtle but important. I wasn't going home, I was visiting as a foreign dignitary, a representative of the crown. Kayla, Lysander started to say. Lady Kayla, I corrected coolly. That is my title now, and you will use it. He nodded, chastened. Lady Kayla, is there any chance we might speak privately? Before you come to our territory? I considered the request. Part of me wanted to refuse, to maintain the distance that protected me from old wounds. But another part, the part that had been growing stronger since I'd found my place at Theron's side, knew that I needed to face this confrontation to truly put it behind me. Very well, I said. One conversation. But make no mistake, it changes nothing between us. Thank you, he whispered, and the gratitude in his voice was so raw it made my chest ache. As the guards escorted the Silvermane delegation from the throne room, Theron moved to stand beside me. Are you all right? He asked softly, his formal mask dropping now that we were essentially alone. I think so, I said, though my hands were shaking slightly. It's strange. I thought seeing him again would hurt more. And does it? I considered the question carefully. It hurts, but not in the way I expected. It hurts like looking at a scar from an old wound. You remember the pain, but it's not sharp anymore. It's just sad. Theron's hand found mine, his fingers intertwining with my own. You handled yourself magnificently. He saw you not as the Omega he rejected, but as the powerful woman you've become. That's a gift you gave yourself. I squeezed his hand, drawing strength from his solid presence beside me. Tomorrow will be harder. Going back to that place, seeing all those faces again. You don't have to go, he said immediately. I can send healers, supplies, whatever they need. You don't have to subject yourself to their judgment again. But I do, I said with growing certainty. Not for them, but for me. I need to return not as their cast-off Omega, but as Lady Kayla, anchor to the king, healer of kingdoms. I need to see their faces when they realize what they lost. Theron brought our joined hands to his lips and pressed a soft kiss to my knuckles. Then you'll go with my blessing, my protection, and my absolute confidence in your strength. Show them what they were too blind to see. That evening, as promised, I met with Lysander in a small receiving room typically used for minor diplomatic meetings. The formal setting was deliberate. This was not a reunion between former mates. but a conversation between a royal advisor and a supplicant. Lysander entered the room looking like a man walking to his execution. The confidence that had once been his defining characteristic was completely gone, replaced by a humility that was almost painful to witness. "I've found where I belong," I continued, gentling my tone slightly. "With Theron, in this castle, using my abilities to help people instead of being ashamed of them. You offered me rejection and exile. He offered me acceptance and a home. The choice is easy. But the mate bond. The mate bond was broken the night you rejected me," I said. "What remains is just an echo, a shadow of what could have been. It's not enough to build a life on, and even if it were, I wouldn't want to." Lysander's face crumpled, and I felt a stab of sympathy for him. But sympathy wasn't the same as forgiveness, and forgiveness wasn't the same as reconciliation. "I'll heal your pack because it's the right thing to do," I said gently. "But when that's done, I'll return here, to my real home, with the man who sees my worth instead of my weaknesses." He nodded slowly, understanding finally dawning in his eyes. "You love him." It wasn't a question, but I answered anyway. "Yes. I do." The admission surprised me with its certainty, but it felt right. What I'd found with Theron was everything the mate bond with Lysander should have been: partnership, respect, deep emotional connection, and a love that saw past surface appearances to the soul beneath. "And he loves you?" "Yes," I said softly. "He does." Lysander was quiet for a long moment, absorbing the finality of it all. When he finally spoke again, his voice held a note of acceptance I hadn't expected. "I'm glad," he said, and he almost sounded like he meant it. "I'm glad you found someone who could see what I was too blind and stupid to recognize. You deserve to be cherished." The unexpected grace in his response caught me off guard. Perhaps there was more to him than I'd given him credit for, even if it had taken losing everything for him to find it. "Thank you," I said simply. He stood to leave, then paused at the door. "For what it's worth, Kayla, Lady Kayla, I am truly, deeply sorry. Not just for rejecting you, but for the way I did it. You didn't deserve that cruelty." "No," I agreed. "I didn't." He nodded once more and left, closing the door softly behind him. I sat alone in the receiving room for several minutes, processing what had just occurred. The confrontation I dreaded had come and gone, and I'd emerged not broken or bitter, but stronger. I was no longer the worthless Omega who had been cast aside. I was Lady Kayla, anchor to the king, and I was exactly where I belonged. Chapter 7: The Weight of Choices. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, with autumn's sunlight streaming through my chamber windows and painting everything in shades of gold. I stood before my mirror, adjusting the traveling dress Theron had commissioned for me, deep forest green with intricate silver embroidery that caught the light when I moved. It was beautiful and expensive, but more importantly, it was armor. When I walked into my former pack's territory today, every thread would announce that I was no longer the broken Omega they had discarded. A soft knock at my door interrupted my preparations. "Come in," I called. Theron entered, magnificent in his formal court attire, a midnight blue jacket with silver trim that matched his eyes, and a circlet of white gold resting on his dark hair. He looked every inch the powerful king, but his expression was soft with concern. "You look beautiful," he said, though his eyes held worry. "Are you ready for this?" "As ready as I'll ever be." I smoothed my hands over the rich fabric of my skirt, drawing confidence from its fine quality. "Your seamstress works quickly." I may have emphasized the urgency of the commission. A small smile tugged at his lips. "I wanted to ensure you had everything you needed to show them exactly what they lost." He moved closer, reaching out to touch my face with gentle fingers. You don't have to prove anything to them, Kayla. You've already proven everything to yourself and to me. I know, I said, leaning into his touch. But this isn't about proving anything anymore. It's about closure. About facing the past as the woman I've become, not the girl I was. His thumb brushed across my cheek, and I felt that familiar warmth bloom in my chest, not the overwhelming flood of absorbed emotions, but something purely my own. Something that felt like coming home. I wish I could come with you, he said quietly. You can't leave the Citadel for that long, and we both know it. I covered his hand with mine. The sorrowing is still too unstable here. But I'll have the royal guard, and I'll be back before you know it. 2 days, he said firmly. If you're not back in 2 days, I'm coming after you. The possessiveness in his tone sent a shiver through me that had nothing to do with cold. Promise me something, I said softly. Anything. Promise me that no matter what they say, what they offer, what they claim about mate bonds or destiny, promise me you'll remember that I chose you. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to. His eyes blazed with something fierce and protective. I promise. And I promise you something in return. When you come home, we're going to talk about making some things permanent. My heart stuttered at the implication in his words. Theron. Go, he said, pressing a soft kiss to my forehead. Show them what they lost, help their people, and come home to me. An hour later, I rode out of the Citadel gates at the head of a royal procession. 20 of Theron's finest guards flanked me, their armor gleaming in the sunlight and their banners snapping in the mountain breeze. I sat astride a magnificent white mare, a gift from Theron's personal stables, and felt like the queen I was slowly becoming. The journey to Silvermane territory took most of the day. As we crossed familiar landmarks, I found myself noting changes, places that looked shabbier than I remembered, fields that seemed less prosperous. The sorrowing's influence was visible everywhere, in the neglected farms and the hollow-eyed people we passed on the road. By late afternoon, we crested the hill that overlooked my former home. The Silvermane Pack's village spread below us, nestled in a valley between rolling hills. It looked smaller than I remembered, somehow diminished. Smoke rose from the chimneys, but there was less of it than there should have been. The streets that should have been full of children playing and adults going about their business were eerily quiet. My lady, Captain Hayes, the head of my guard, rode up beside me. Shall we announce our arrival? Yes, I said, straightening in my saddle. Make sure they know exactly who has come to call. The horn blast that announced a royal delegation echoed across the valley, clear and commanding. I watched as people emerged from their homes, shading their eyes to look up at the hill where we waited. Even at this distance, I could feel their confusion and curiosity. We rode down into the village in formation, and I kept my expression serene as familiar faces turned to stare. Some looked puzzled, as if they almost recognized me but couldn't place where they'd seen me before. Others, those who had been at the ceremony that night, went pale with shock. Mrs. Henderson, who used to scold me for dawdling in her vegetable garden, dropped the basket of turnips she'd been carrying. Young Thomas, now a few months older and broader in the shoulders, actually stumbled backward in surprise. Old Sarah pressed a hand to her chest as if she couldn't quite believe what she was seeing. We stopped in the central square, where a hastily assembled reception committee waited. Alpha Marcus stood at their head, looking haggard and older than his years. Beside him, Lysander appeared to be barely holding himself together. But it was the woman standing slightly behind them who made my breath catch. My mother. She looked friendlier than I remembered, her dark hair now streaked with silver and her face lined with worry. When our eyes met across the square, I saw her face cycle through the same expressions Lysander's had the day before: confusion, disbelief, and finally recognition so sharp it was almost painful. Captain Hayes dismounted and approached the Alpha, his voice carrying clearly in the afternoon air. His Majesty, King Theron of the Northern Realm, sends greetings to the Silvermane Pack. We escort Lady Kayla, royal anchor and advisor to the crown, who comes in response to your request for aid. The formal introduction had exactly the effect I'd hoped for. Gasps rippled through the gathered crowd, and I saw more than one person's jaw drop in shock. The broken Omega they'd watched being dragged away in chains had returned as nobility. I dismounted with practiced grace, accepting Captain Hayes' assistance as a lady should. My traveling dress swept around me like liquid emerald, and the silver circlet Theron had insisted I wear caught the light as I moved. Alpha Marcus, I said, inclining my head just enough to be polite but not enough to suggest subservience. Thank you for gathering to receive me. I understand your pack is suffering from the sorrowing, and I've come to offer what aid I can. The Alpha stepped forward, clearly struggling with how to address me. The girl he'd sold as damaged goods now outranked him significantly. Lady Kayla, he managed, the title sounding awkward on his lips. We are grateful for your assistance. We had hoped, but we never imagined that the worthless Omega you sold would return as a royal advisor. I supplied gently, watching him flinch. The moon goddess has an interesting sense of humor, doesn't she? Please, my mother's voice cut through the tension, raw with emotion. Kayla, may I speak with you? I turned to look at her fully for the first time, taking in the changes the months had wrought. She looked smaller somehow, diminished by grief and regret. You may address me as Lady Kayla, I said quietly. And yes, we can speak. But first, I have work to do. I turned to address the crowd that had gathered, projecting my voice so all could hear. I know many of you are suffering. The sorrowing is a terrible affliction that feeds on negative emotions and amplifies them until they become unbearable. But I want you to know that relief is possible. Hope flickered in their faces, the first genuine emotion other than shock I'd seen since arriving. Tonight, I will perform a cleansing ritual that should help ease the worst of the symptoms. But I need you to understand, this is not a cure. The sorrowing feeds on unresolved conflicts, broken bonds, and emotional wounds left to fester. True healing will require you to address the underlying causes. My eyes found Lysander in the crowd, then moved to Alpha Marcus, making my meaning clear without saying it outright. For now, gather in the ceremonial circle at sunset. Bring your children, your elderly, anyone who has been affected. And bring your hope, that's more powerful than any magic I might work. The crowd began to disperse, buzzing with whispered conversations. I watched them go, noting the mixture of excitement and apprehension on their faces. Some still looked at me with wonder, as if they couldn't quite believe what they were seeing. Kayla. My mother approached hesitantly, her voice barely above a whisper. Please, can we talk? Privately? I studied her for a moment, taking in the deep lines of regret etched around her eyes, the way her hands trembled slightly as she waited for my answer. Very well, I said finally. But make it brief. I have preparations to attend to. She led me to a small cottage on the edge of the village. Not our old family home, I noted. This one was smaller, shabbier, with a garden that had been left to grow wild. Your father and I. She began once we were inside, then stopped, unable to meet my eyes. After you were gone, things changed. The pack blamed us for having such a defective daughter. Your father lost his position as senior hunter. We were moved here, to the edge of the territory. I felt a stab of something that might have been sympathy, but I pushed it down. I'm sorry for your hardships, I said formally. But I fail to see how that concerns me. Don't you see? She turned to me with desperate eyes. We've all paid for what happened that night. The pack has been falling apart ever since. Families turning on each other, violence where there used to be peace. It's like a curse fell on us the moment you were taken away. Not taken, I corrected coldly. Sold. By your alpha. With your consent. She flinched as if I'd slapped her. I know. I know what we did was wrong. But you have to understand, we thought we were doing what was best for the pack. A rejected Omega, we thought you'd be happier somewhere else. Happier? I laughed, but there was no humor in it. You thought I'd be happier being sold into sexual slavery to a mad king? We didn't know. You didn't care, I said flatly. There's a difference. My mother sank into a chair, her face crumpling. You're right. We were ashamed, and we chose the easy path. We chose the pack's approval over our own daughter's welfare. Tears began to stream down her cheeks. I haven't slept peacefully since that night. Every time I close my eyes, I see your face as they dragged you away. For a moment, the familiar tug of my empathic abilities stirred, urging me to comfort her, to ease her pain. But I had learned to control that impulse, to choose when and how to use my gift. I'm not here to absolve you of guilt, I said quietly. That's something you'll have to live with. I'm here to help the innocent people who are suffering because of choices they didn't make. Can you ever forgive us? She whispered. I was quiet for a long moment, considering the question. Could I forgive them? Did I want to? I don't know, I said finally, and it was the truth. Maybe someday. But not today. Today, I'm focused on the future, not the past. She nodded, seeming to understand that it was more than she deserved. You look well, she said softly, trying to change the subject. Happy. The dress is beautiful, and you carry yourself like a queen. I am loved, I said simply. By someone who sees my worth instead of my weaknesses. Someone who chose me not despite what I am, but because of it. The king? Yes. I couldn't keep the warmth from my voice when I spoke of Theron. He values my gifts. He protects me. He makes me feel like I'm exactly where I belong. My mother's face crumpled further. Everything we said about you being worthless, about your gifts being useless, we were so wrong. Yes, I agreed. You were. The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Captain Hayes stepped inside, his expression respectful but urgent. My lady, forgive the intrusion, but we should begin preparations for the ritual. The sun will set soon. I nodded, grateful for the escape. Of course. Mother, I turned back to her, we'll speak again before I leave. But for now, I have work to do. As I walked toward the ceremonial circle with my guard escort, I found myself thinking about forgiveness. It would be easy to say I'd moved past the hurt, that their betrayal no longer mattered. But that would be a lie. The truth was more complicated. I had found happiness despite their actions, not because I'd forgotten them. The girl who had been broken that night was still part of me, and she deserved to have her pain acknowledged. But she also deserved to be more than her pain. The ceremonial circle looked much the same as it had on that fateful night months ago, though smaller somehow. The stones that marked its boundary seemed weathered, and the grass within was patchy and brown. As the sun began to set, people gathered as I'd requested. They came hesitantly at first, then in larger groups as word spread. I saw faces I recognized, some kind, some cruel, all marked by the weariness that came with carrying the sorrowing's weight. I stood in the center of the circle, no longer the desperate Omega hoping for acceptance, but a woman who had found her power and her place. The silver circlet on my head caught the dying light, and my green dress seemed to glow in the gathering dusk. "People of the Silvermane Pack," I called out, my voice carrying clearly in the evening air. "You are here because you are in pain. Because something in your hearts and souls has been wounded, and that wound has made you vulnerable to a darkness that feeds on suffering." Murmurs rippled through the crowd as they absorbed my words. "The sorrowing is not a random curse," I continued. "It's attracted to places where emotional bonds have been severed, where trust has been broken, where love has been rejected in favor of fear." I let my gaze move across the crowd, making eye contact with as many as I could. "It came to your territory because something fundamental was damaged here. A bond that should have been sacred was broken in a moment of pride and prejudice." Some in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, understanding beginning to dawn on their faces. "But tonight, we have a choice," I said, raising my voice. "We can let that broken bond continue to poison this place, or we can heal it. Not by pretending it never happened, but by acknowledging the harm that was done and choosing to do better." I closed my eyes and reached out with my abilities, feeling the emotional landscape of the gathered pack. The sorrowing was there, a dark stain that pulsed with anger and despair. But underneath it, I sensed something else: regret, shame, and buried deep beneath all of it, a tiny seed of hope. "Join hands," I instructed. "Form a circle around me. And prepare to feel what you've been hiding from yourselves." As they moved to obey, linking fingers with neighbors and former enemies alike, I began to draw the sorrowing's influence into myself. But this time, instead of simply absorbing it, I transformed it. I took their anger and showed them the hurt beneath it. I took their despair and revealed the love that had been wounded. I took their shame and reflected back their capacity for growth. The process was exhausting, more draining than anything I'd ever attempted. But as the last of the supernatural darkness left the circle, I felt something beautiful take its place, not the absence of pain, but the presence of understanding. When I opened my eyes, many in the crowd were weeping. But these were healing tears, not the bitter ones they'd shed under the sorrowing's influence. "The curse is broken," I announced, though my voice was weak with exhaustion. "What you do with this second chance is up to you." As the crowd began to disperse, talking in hushed, wondering voices, Lysander approached me. His face was streaked with tears, but his eyes were clearer than I'd seen them since my return. "Kayla, Lady Kayla," he corrected himself quickly. "What you just did, the healing you've given us, how can we ever repay you?" I looked at him for a long moment, this man who had been my greatest heartbreak and who had inadvertently led me to my greatest happiness. "By learning," I said simply. "By remembering that every person has value, even if you can't see it at first glance. By choosing love over fear, acceptance over judgment." He nodded, understanding. And us? Is there any hope for?" "No," I said gently but firmly. "That bond was broken beyond repair, and honestly, I'm glad it was. It led me to where I truly belong." Something shifted in his expression then, not the desperate hope I'd expected, but something that looked almost like relief. "I'm glad too," he said quietly. "Glad you found someone who could appreciate what I was too foolish to see. You deserve to be loved completely, without reservation." It was, I realized, the closest thing to a blessing he could give me. As I prepared to return to my temporary quarters for the night, I felt a sense of completion I hadn't expected. I had faced my past not as its victim, but as its victor. I had healed not just the pack's supernatural affliction, but something in myself as well. Tomorrow, I would return to the Citadel. I would return to Theron, to my real home, to the life I had chosen rather than the one that had been chosen for me. And I would do so with my heart fully free. Chapter 8, The Corruption Spreads. I woke before dawn in the small cottage that had been prepared for me, the same one where I'd spoken with my mother the evening before. Through the window, I could see the village beginning to stir, and there was something different about the quality of movement. Where yesterday people had moved with the heavy, dragging steps of the emotionally burdened, today they walked with purpose and energy. The healing had worked. But as I prepared for the journey home, a familiar cold dread began to settle in my stomach. Something was wrong. Not here. The Silvermane territory felt clean, purged of the supernatural darkness that had plagued it. The wrongness was coming from somewhere else. It was coming from home. I dressed quickly in my traveling clothes and found Captain Hayes already waiting with the horses. "My lady," he said, his weathered face creased with concern, "we received a message from the citadel during the night. His Majesty requests your immediate return." My heart clenched with fear. "What's happened?" "The sorrowing, my lady. It's changed. Grown more violent. There have been incidents." I was in the saddle before he finished speaking. "How long to reach the citadel if we ride hard?" 6 hours, if we don't stop." "Then we don't stop." We left the Silvermane territory at a gallop, my royal guard falling into formation around me. As we rode, Captain Hayes filled me in on what little he knew from the brief message. The night before, shortly after sunset, around the time I had been performing the healing ritual, the sorrowing in the citadel had undergone a violent transformation. Instead of the familiar crushing sadness, it had become something sharp and angry. Servants had turned on each other with sudden, inexplicable rage. Guards had abandoned their posts to settle old grudges with their fists. Even the nobles had been affected, with several minor lords drawing swords over imagined slights. His Majesty was able to restore some order, Captain Hayes continued as we crested a hill, but only by confining most of the court to their quarters. The message said the king himself was struggling. The implications hit me like a physical blow. Without me there to help him manage the sorrowing, Theron was bearing the full weight of the affliction alone. And now it had become something more dangerous than mere despair. It was actively malevolent. We rode through the morning and into the afternoon, stopping only to water the horses and allow them brief rests. With each mile we covered, the wrongness in the air grew stronger. By the time the citadel's towers came into view, I could feel it like a physical pressure against my skull. The guards at the outer gates looked haggard and tense. Their eyes darted nervously as they recognized our party, and I saw several hands resting on sword hilts, not in greeting, but in barely restrained aggression. "Lady Kayla," the gate captain said, his voice tight with effort. "Thank the goddess you've returned. The king, he's been asking for you." We rode through the courtyard, and the change was immediately apparent. Where before there had been a sense of peaceful purpose, now there was an undercurrent of violence barely held in check. Servants scurried along the walls, avoiding eye contact with anyone. The few guards we passed looked like men on the edge of snapping. I dismounted in front of the main entrance and ran up the steps, my heart hammering with fear. If Theron had been overwhelmed by this new, aggressive form of the sorrowing. I found him in his study, slumped in his chair with his head in his hands. But he wasn't weeping as he had been that first night. Instead, his entire body was rigid with tension, his knuckles white as he gripped his hair. "Theron," I breathed. His head snapped up, and I gasped at what I saw. His silver eyes were bloodshot and wild, his face drawn with exhaustion and something that looked like barely contained rage. This wasn't the gentle man who had held me while I shivered with absorbed pain. This was something, on the very edge of violence. "Kayla." My name was a growl, almost unrecognizable. "You came back." I approached him slowly, the way one might approach a wounded animal. "Of course I came back. What's happened?" What's changed? Everything. He stood abruptly, and I saw his hands were shaking, not with weakness, but with the effort of maintaining control. The moment you left, the sorrowing began to transform. It's not just sadness anymore, Kayla. It's rage. Pure, violent rage, and it's spreading like wildfire. He gestured toward the window that overlooked the courtyard. 3 servants attacked each other in the kitchens last night. 2 guards tried to settle a dispute with swords instead of words. Lord Garrett nearly strangled his own son over a minor disagreement. The horror of it settled over me like a shroud. And you? How are you managing it? His laugh was bitter and sharp. I'm not. Without you here to anchor me, to pull away even a portion of the pain, I'm drowning in it. But it's not drowning anymore, it's burning. Every moment of anger, every flash of violence from every person in the kingdom, it all flows into me like molten metal. I reached out to touch his face, and he flinched away from my hand. Don't, he said roughly. I don't trust myself right now. The rage, it's so strong, Kayla. I'm afraid I might hurt you. You won't, I said with absolute certainty. You would never hurt me. I might not have a choice. His voice cracked with desperation. This isn't like before. This new corruption, it doesn't just want to break spirits, it wants to break bodies. It wants blood. As if summoned by his words, a commotion erupted in the corridor outside. Shouts, the sound of furniture crashing, a woman's scream of pain. Theron was on his feet instantly, his face twisting with fresh agony. It's getting worse. Every act of violence feeds it, makes it stronger. And the stronger it gets, the more violence it inspires. We're caught in a spiral that's going to destroy everything. I closed my eyes and reached out with my abilities, trying to sense the source of this new malevolence. The familiar technique that had served me so well before hit a wall of searing anger that nearly knocked me to my knees. There, I gasped, pointing toward the floor. It's coming from below. Deep below, in the foundations of the citadel itself. Theron's eyes followed my gesture, and something flickered across his face. Recognition? Fear? The old dungeons, he said slowly. They were sealed years ago. My father said they were unstable, dangerous. We have to go down there, I said, already moving toward the door. Whatever is causing this, it's not natural. Someone or something is actively feeding the corruption. Kayla, no. He caught my arm, his grip just slightly too tight. If there's something down there, something powerful enough to corrupt the sorrowing itself, it's too dangerous. I won't risk losing you. And I won't watch you be destroyed by something we could stop, I countered. Together, Theron. We face this together, or we fall together. For a moment, I saw the man I loved break through the rage-filled stranger wearing his face. I can't lose you, he whispered. You're the only good thing left in my life. Then don't lose me, I said, standing on my toes to press a gentle kiss to his forehead. Trust me. Trust us. He closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, some of the wildness had faded. All right. But we go armed, and we go carefully. If this is a trap, then we spring it on our terms. 20 minutes later, we stood before a heavy iron door I had never seen before, hidden behind a tapestry in the deepest part of the citadel's basement levels. The door was old, ancient even, with rust stains that looked suspiciously like dried blood. Theron carried a sword at his hip and a torch in his hand. I had armed myself with something more subtle but potentially more powerful, a collection of focusing crystals and protective charms I'd hastily assembled from my supplies. The door is slightly open, Theron observed, his voice tight with tension. Indeed, the massive door hung ajar by perhaps an inch, just enough for something to slip through. Something like supernatural malevolence. How long has it been sealed? I asked. 25 years. Since before I was crowned. He pushed the door open slowly, the hinges screaming in protest. My father claimed there was nothing down there but empty cells and bad memories. The corridor beyond was narrow and low-ceilinged, carved directly from the living rock of the mountain. Our footsteps echoed hollowly as we descended, and the temperature dropped with each step. But more disturbing than the cold was the feeling that pressed against us, not the familiar weight of the sorrowing, but something older and more focused. Something that felt almost intelligent. Theron, I whispered, I don't think your father sealed this place to keep people out. I think he sealed it to keep something in. Before he could respond, we heard it, a sound that made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. It was singing. A woman's voice, soft and sweet, singing a lullaby that might have been beautiful if not for the undercurrent of madness that threaded through every note. The song was coming from the chamber ahead, where flickering light danced against stone walls. Theron and I exchanged glances, both understanding that we had found the source of the corruption. Whatever awaited us in that chamber, it had been feeding on pain and rage for decades, growing stronger with each passing year. And now it knew we were coming. The singing stopped. In the sudden silence, a woman's voice called out, cultured and amused. Hello, nephew. You look just like your father did at your age. Though I must say, the years have been kinder to you than they were to him. Theron's face went white. That's impossible, he breathed. Is it? The voice asked, laughing with genuine delight. Come now, don't be shy. Bring your little pet with you. I'm quite curious to meet the creature who's been interfering with my work. With trembling hands, Theron pushed open the door to reveal a sight that would haunt my dreams for years to come. The chamber was larger than the narrow corridor had suggested, with a high ceiling that disappeared into shadow. Ancient chains hung from the walls, and the floor was stained with substances I preferred not to identify. But it was the figure in the center of the room that stole my breath. She had once been beautiful, that much was clear despite the ravages of time and madness. Her hair, which might have been golden in youth, now hung around her shoulders like tarnished silver. Her dress, though faded and torn, had once been fine. Her face, while gaunt and marked by years of isolation, still held traces of aristocratic beauty. But it was her eyes that truly horrified me. They glowed with an inner light that was definitely not natural, a cold, silver radiance that spoke of power stolen from pain and madness nursed into strength. Aunt Michelle, Theron whispered, his voice breaking. But you're dead. Father said you died of a fever 25 years ago. The woman, Michelle, threw back her head and laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Dead? Oh, my dear boy, I'm very much alive. Though I suppose alive is a relative term when one has spent the better part of 3 decades chained in a dungeon, fed nothing but scraps and promises of eventual freedom. She gestured to the shackles that had clearly once bound her to the wall, now broken and lying in pieces on the floor. Your father was always a liar, nephew. But he was also, ultimately, a fool. He thought he could contain me forever, keep me locked away like a shameful secret. Theron staggered as if she'd struck him. Why? Why would he imprison you? Because I fell in love with the wrong man. Michelle's voice turned bitter, the glow in her eyes flaring brighter. I committed the unforgivable sin of choosing a human over a wolf, of putting my heart before my bloodline. So your father, my beloved brother, had my lover executed and me locked away to think about what I'd done. The casual way she spoke of such cruelty made my stomach turn. But beneath the madness, I could feel something else, a pain so deep and profound it had fossilized into something hard and cutting. 25 years, she continued, beginning to pace in a circle around us. 25 years of darkness and solitude and dreams of revenge. Do you know what that kind of isolation does to a person, nephew? Especially one with certain talents? She gestured, and the temperature in the room dropped another 10 degrees. The torchlight flickered as if something was trying to snuff it out. I learned to feed on the pain that seeped down from above. Every moment of sadness, every flash of anger, every tear shed in the citadel became food for my growing power. And when I finally broke free of those chains, oh, just a few months ago, I'm afraid, I realized I had become something wonderful. Her eyes fixed on me then, and I felt the full weight of her attention like a physical pressure. I became a goddess of suffering. And you, little Omega, have been interfering with my grand work. The pieces clicked together in my mind with horrible clarity. You're not just feeding on the sorrowing, I said, my voice steady despite the terror clawing at my throat. You're creating it. Directing it. You've been using the Citadel's pain to fuel your power for decades. Very good. Michelle clapped her hands in mock delight. I knew you were clever the moment you began stealing my food. Every time you soothe your king's pain, every moment of peace you give him, you're taking sustenance from me. I simply cannot allow that to continue. She stopped directly in front of me, so close I could see the madness swirling in those glowing eyes. But I'm not unreasonable, she continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. I have a proposition for you, little anchor. Join me. Help me spread the pain instead of easing it. Together, we can make them all understand what real suffering feels like. The offer hung in the air between us, terrible and tempting in its own way. Here was someone who had been betrayed as I had been, cast aside as I had been. Someone who understood the depth of that particular wound. But as I looked into her mad, glowing eyes, I saw something that chilled me more than her threats or her power. I saw what I could have become. No, I said firmly. Michelle's face twisted with disappointment and rage. Pity. I had hoped you would be reasonable. She raised her hand, and I felt power gathering around her like a storm. But if you won't join me willingly, perhaps I can convince you another way. The attack, when it came, wasn't physical. It was pure emotional agony, every moment of pain I had ever felt, amplified and reflected back at me tenfold. The rejection, the betrayal, the crushing loneliness, all of it crashed into my mind at once. I screamed and fell to my knees, my hands clutching at my head as if I could physically hold my sanity together. Stop. Theron's voice was a roar of fury and desperation. Leave her alone. Oh, but I'm just getting started, Michelle said sweetly. You see, nephew, your little pet has been taking something that belongs to me. Now I'm simply taking it back. The pain intensified, and I felt my consciousness beginning to fracture under the assault. But through the agony, I heard something that gave me hope. Theron's voice, strong and sure, Kayla, hold on. I'm coming. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that he would find a way to reach me. Even if it killed him. Chapter 9, The Witch's Bargain. Through the haze of agony that Michelle was pouring into my mind, I was dimly aware of Theron moving toward us, his sword drawn and his face a mask of deadly intent. But the ancient witch merely smiled and gestured casually with her free hand. Invisible force slammed into Theron like a battering ram, hurling him backward against the stone wall with a sickening crack. He slumped to the floor, dazed but not unconscious, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead. Michelle tooted, never breaking her concentration on the mental assault she was inflicting on me. Violence is so crude, don't you think? though I suppose it runs in the family. She increased the pressure, and I felt another layer of my defenses crumble. The pain was beyond description, not just emotional now, but physical. Every nerve in my body felt like it was on fire. You know, Michelle continued conversationally, as if she weren't slowly torturing me to death, I felt you working your little healing ritual last night. All that energy, all that power, flowing away from my territory and back to its natural source. Me. Through gritted teeth, I managed to gasp out, the Silvermane pack, they're free of you now. For the moment, she agreed. But pain finds a way, little Omega. It always finds a way. When word spreads of what I'm about to do here, when the other packs realize that even the great King Theron couldn't protect his precious anchor, the despair will be exquisite. She leaned closer, her glowing eyes boring into mine. But it doesn't have to end this way. Join me willingly, and I'll make their deaths quick. Refuse, and I'll ensure they suffer for weeks before I grant them the mercy of madness. I looked at Theron, who was struggling to get back to his feet despite what was clearly a concussion. Even injured, even facing impossible odds, he was trying to reach me. The love and determination in his silver eyes gave me strength I didn't know I possessed. There's a third option, I said, my voice growing stronger despite the pain. Michelle raised an eyebrow. Oh. And what might that be? I stop you. With every ounce of will I possessed, I began to push back against her mental assault. Right here. Right now. The witch laughed, a sound like breaking cathedral bells. Child, I have been feeding on pain for 25 years. I am beyond your little empathic tricks now. I am a force of nature, a goddess of. Her words cut off in a gasp of surprise as I did something she wasn't expecting. Instead of trying to shield myself from her attack, I opened myself to it completely. I let every ounce of agony she was pouring into me flow through my barriers and into my core. But I didn't just absorb it, I began to understand it. Through the connection she had forged between us, I felt her true pain. Beneath all the madness and power and carefully constructed hatred was something heartbreaking in its simplicity, a young woman who had loved someone with her whole heart and watched him die for the crime of loving her back. The 25 years of rage, the carefully nurtured resentment, the pleasure she took in others' suffering, all of it was just an elaborate wall built around one simple, devastating truth. She was lonely. Stop, she hissed, trying to pull back from the connection, but it was too late. The bond was established now, and I was the stronger of us when it came to emotional manipulation. I poured my own pain into the link, not as a weapon, but as an offering. My rejection, my betrayal, my desperate loneliness in those early days at the Citadel. I showed her how I had found healing not through revenge, but through love. Stop, she screamed, staggering backward. The glow in her eyes flickered like a candle in wind. You don't understand. They have to pay for what they did. They already have, I said, climbing slowly to my feet. The agony was still there, but it was manageable now that I wasn't fighting it. Your brother is dead, Michelle. He died years ago, probably tormented by guilt over what he'd done to you. The guards who killed your lover are gone. The system that condemned you has crumbled. But the pain, she began. The pain was real, I agreed, taking a careful step toward her. What they did to you was unforgivable. But causing more pain won't bring him back. It won't undo the damage. It will only create more broken people, more Michelles locked away in their own prisons of rage. For a moment, the madness in her eyes cleared, and I saw the woman she had been before 25 years of isolation had twisted her into something monstrous. You don't know what it's like, she whispered. To lose everything. To be betrayed by the people who claimed to love you. Don't I? I let her feel the echo of my mate bond with Lysander, the way it had been severed so cruelly in front of everyone I'd ever known. The difference between us, Michelle, is what we chose to do with that pain. I chose power, she said, but there was doubt in her voice now. You chose isolation, I corrected gently. You chose to let the wound fester instead of letting it heal. But it's not too late. It's never too late to choose differently. Behind me, I heard Theron getting to his feet, but he made no aggressive moves. He understood, somehow, that this battle wouldn't be won with swords. Michelle was quiet for a long moment, her glowing eyes fixed on something I couldn't see. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, more human. His name was Marcus, she said. He was a scholar, fascinated by our kind but not afraid of us. He saw me not as a weapon or a political tool, but as a woman. Just a woman who happened to love books and music and quiet evenings by the fire. Tell me about him, I said, moving another step closer. He had the gentlest hands, she continued, tears beginning to track down her cheeks. When he touched me, I felt precious. Cherished. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was enough exactly as I was. I could feel her power beginning to waver as she allowed herself to remember love instead of loss. What happened to him? My brother found out about our meetings. He said Marcus was a spy, sent to learn our weaknesses. He claimed the relationship was treasonous. Her voice broke completely. They made me watch as they executed him. My brother said it was a lesson about the price of betraying one's own kind. The cruelty of it stole my breath. No wonder she had broken. No wonder she had spent decades nursing her rage. I'm sorry, I said, and meant it. You deserved so much better than that. Did I? She looked at me with eyes full of desperate hope. After all I've done, all the pain I've caused? Yes, I said firmly. Everyone deserves the chance to be loved. Everyone deserves the chance to heal. For a moment, I thought I had reached her. The glow in her eyes continued to dim, and the oppressive weight of supernatural malevolence in the air began to lighten. Then her face twisted with sudden, renewed fury, but this time it was different. This wasn't rage at me or Theron, it was rage at herself, at the choices she'd made, at the pain she'd caused. But look what I've become, she cried, her voice breaking. Look what I've done. I've poisoned an entire kingdom with my bitterness. I've made innocent people suffer because I couldn't bear my own suffering. The supernatural pressure in the room began to fluctuate wildly as her control wavered between self-hatred and the first glimpses of genuine remorse. I can't undo it, she sobbed, falling to her knees. I can't bring back the people who died because of the violence I inspired. I can't heal the families torn apart by the rage I spread. No, I agreed, kneeling beside her. You can't undo the past. But Michelle, you can choose what happens next. What's the point? She asked bitterly. The damage is done. I'm a monster. You're a woman who was hurt so badly that she forgot how to be human, I corrected gently. But choosing to remember, that's always possible. I reached out slowly, telegraphing my movements so she could pull away if she wanted to. When she didn't, I placed my hand gently on her shoulder. Let me help you, I said. Not to take away your pain, that's yours to carry and learn from. But let me help you transform it into something that can heal instead of harm. Michelle looked up at me with eyes that were no longer glowing with supernatural power, just wet with very human tears. How? The same way Marcus loved you, I said. The same way Theron loves me. By choosing to see the person beneath the pain. She was quiet for a long moment, her breathing gradually slowing as she considered my words. When she spoke again, her voice was barely a whisper. I loved him so much. And when they killed him, when my brother looked me in the eye and said it was for my own good, something inside me died. I stopped believing that love was worth the risk. But you loved him anyway, I pointed out. Even after he was gone, even after it cost you everything, you kept loving him. That's not weakness, Michelle. That's the strongest thing there is. I don't know how to stop, she admitted. The anger, the need for revenge, it's been my purpose for so long. Without it, I don't know who I am. Then let's find out together, I said. I closed my eyes and reached out with my empathic abilities, but this time I didn't try to absorb her pain. Instead, I shared my own, not as a weapon or manipulation, but as an offering of understanding. I showed her my rejection, my humiliation, the crushing loneliness of those first days in the Citadel. But I also showed her what came after. The moment Theron first looked at me with kindness instead of pity. The warmth of being valued for who I was rather than what I could provide. The slow, careful process of learning to trust again. You can have this too, I whispered. Not the same love, that was yours and Marcus's alone. But you can have connection again. Purpose that builds instead of destroys. Through our link, I felt her defenses finally, completely crumble. The rage that had sustained her for 25 years drained away, leaving behind something raw and wounded but finally, genuinely human. I'm so tired, she said, and she sounded like a lost child. Then rest, I said gently. But not the rest of revenge or rage. The rest that comes after forgiveness. How do I even begin to ask for forgiveness, she asked. How do I face the people I've hurt? You start with yourself, I said. You forgive the frightened girl who lost everything and didn't know how to grieve properly. You forgive the broken woman who made terrible choices because she thought they were the only choices available. Michelle's tears were flowing freely now, washing away years of accumulated bitterness. And then you help me fix what we can fix, and learn to live with what we can't. She nodded slowly, understanding beginning to dawn in her eyes. The sorrowing, I can help you reverse it completely. Not just suppress it, but actually heal the damage it's done to people's capacity for joy. Is that possible? With both our powers combined, yes. She looked at her hands, noting how they no longer glowed with supernatural malevolence. But it will cost me. The energy I've been using to sustain myself all these years, if I channel it into healing instead of harm, I won't have enough left to live, I finished quietly. She nodded. I should have died 25 years ago, when they locked me away. I've been borrowing time ever since, time fueled by anger and pain. If I let that go, if I transform it into something healing. She shrugged. I'll finally be able to join Marcus. Michelle, you don't have to. Yes, I do, she said with quiet certainty. This is my choice. My first real choice in 25 years. Let me make it count. She stood, and for the first time since I'd met her, she looked peaceful. The madness was gone from her eyes, replaced by a calm resolution that reminded me somehow of Theron. Besides, she said with a small smile, you'll need all the power you can get to heal an entire kingdom. And I can think of no better legacy than turning a quarter-century of accumulated pain into hope. Chapter 10, The Ultimate Sacrifice. Theron stepped forward, his expression gentle but grave despite the blood still trickling from his head wound. Aunt Michelle, he said formally, on behalf of the Northern Realm, I accept your offer to help heal the damage that has been done. And I want you to know, what my father did to you was wrong. I can't undo it, but I can acknowledge it, and I can promise that such cruelty will never be sanctioned in my kingdom again. Michelle's eyes filled with tears again, but these were tears of gratitude rather than pain. Thank you, nephew. That means more than you know. She looked around the dungeon that had been her prison for so long, then back at us. Shall we go upstairs? I'd like to see the sun one more time before. Of course, Theron said, offering her his arm with the courtesy due to a royal aunt rather than a prisoner. As we climbed the stairs toward the light, I felt the Sorrowing's malevolent influence already beginning to fade. In its place was something else, not the absence of sadness, but the presence of hope. The citadel was in chaos when we emerged, but it was a different kind of chaos now. The supernatural rage was dissipating rapidly, leaving confused servants and guards trying to understand why they had been so angry just moments before. The violence was stopping, replaced by bewildered conversations and hesitant reconciliations. The healing has to happen quickly, Michelle said as we made our way toward the throne room. Once I begin the process of transforming the accumulated power, I won't be able to maintain it for long. She paused at a window, looking out over the kingdom she had unknowingly terrorized for so long. In the afternoon light, she looked friendlier than she had in the dungeon's shadows, an old woman whose borrowed time was finally running out. There's something else, she said quietly. The Sorrowing didn't just affect this kingdom. It spread, following trade routes and family connections, touching every territory that has had contact with the Northern Realm. To truly heal it, we'll need to reach every person it has touched. My heart sank as I realized the scope of what we were attempting. How many people are we talking about? Thousands, she said simply. Maybe tens of thousands. Theron moved to stand beside me, his presence steadying as always. We'll find a way, he said firmly. Whatever it takes. There is a way, Michelle said, but it requires perfect trust between the three of us. Theron, your connection to your people through the royal bloodline. Kayla, your empathic abilities and the strength you've developed. And me, the accumulated power of 25 years of pain. She looked at us both seriously. Together, we can create a healing wave that will sweep across every territory the Sorrowing has touched. What do you need us to do? I asked. We'll need to perform the ritual in the throne room, at the heart of the kingdom's power. Theron will need to open himself completely to every citizen's emotions, not just to feel them, but to serve as a conduit. Kayla, you'll channel the healing energy through that connection, reaching every person simultaneously. And you? Theron asked. Michelle's smile was sad but peaceful. I'll provide the power. All of it. Every bit of energy that's been keeping me alive, transformed from poison into medicine. The weight of what she was offering settled over us. This wasn't just healing, it was the ultimate act of redemption, transforming decades of accumulated bitterness into its exact opposite. We spent the next hour preparing the throne room. Michelle directed the placement of focusing crystals in a complex pattern around the throne, while I gathered the herbs and oils needed for the ritual. Theron ensured we would be undisturbed, posting his most trusted guards at every entrance. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the tall windows, we were ready to begin. One more thing, Michelle said as we took our positions. Kayla, when the power transfer begins, you're going to feel everything I've felt for the past 25 years. Not just the pain, but the love underneath it, the hope that was buried but never completely destroyed. Don't fight it. Let it flow through you and into the healing. I nodded, understanding. This wasn't just about magical power, it was about emotional truth, about transforming genuine human experience into something that could touch other human hearts. Theron sat on his throne, his hands resting on the carved armrests, his expression already growing distant as he began to open himself to his people's emotions. I knelt before the throne, my hands placed on his knees, ready to channel whatever came through our connection. Michelle stood behind us both, her hands raised, power already beginning to shimmer around her like heat waves. "Now," she said softly. The transformation began slowly. I felt Theron's consciousness expand, reaching out through the mystical bonds that connected a king to his subjects. One by one, I sensed the people of the Northern Realm, farmers in distant fields, merchants in busy markets, children playing in village squares. Each connection was a thread of light in my mind, and through each thread flowed the residual influence of the sorrowing. Then Michelle's power touched me, and the world exploded into sensation. I experienced her entire life in an instant, the joy of falling in love with Marcus, the agony of watching him die, the slow descent into madness during those early years of imprisonment. But I also felt things she had forgotten, Marcus's laughter, the way he used to read to her by firelight, the absolute safety she had felt in his arms. The power that flowed from her wasn't just magical energy, it was love itself, refined by suffering but ultimately purified by her choice to heal rather than harm. I became a conduit for that love, channeling it through Theron's connection to his people and out into the kingdom. Wherever the healing energy touched, I felt the sorrowing's influence dissolve like ice in sunlight. But more than that, I felt people's natural capacity for joy being restored, their ability to hope being renewed. A farmer who had been plagued by inexplicable rage suddenly felt peace settle over him like a blessing. A mother whose children had been having nightmares watched them smile in their sleep for the first time in months. A merchant who had been consumed by greed remembered the simple pleasure of helping a customer find exactly what they needed. The healing spread outward in ripples, following every connection the sorrowing had used to propagate itself. I felt it reach the Silvermane territory, completing the work I had begun there. I felt it touch distant kingdoms, cleansing the supernatural malevolence that had seeped across borders. But as the healing wave expanded, I felt Michelle growing weaker. The power flowing through her was literally her life force, and with each person we healed, she became more translucent, more distant. "Michelle," I gasped, trying to pull back some of the energy to sustain her. "No," she said firmly, her voice already sounding far away. "All of it. Every last drop. Let them feel what real love looks like." So I did. I channeled her final reserves of strength into the healing wave, sending it racing across the entire continent. I felt it reach places I had never seen, touching people whose names I would never know, healing wounds that had festered for months or years. When it was over, when the last thread of connection had been cleansed and the final trace of the sorrowing had been transformed into hope, I opened my eyes to find Michelle barely visible, her form shimmering like moonlight on water. "Is it done?" she whispered. I reached out with my abilities, testing the emotional atmosphere of the realm. Where once there had been an underlying current of supernatural despair, now there was only the normal range of human feelings, some sad, some happy, but all natural and healthy. "It's done," I confirmed. "The sorrowing is gone. Completely." Michelle smiled, and for a moment she looked exactly as she must have when she was young and in love and the world was full of possibility. "Good," she said. "Then I can rest now." She looked at Theron, who was slowly returning to full consciousness as the magical connections faded. "Take care of her, nephew. And take care of your kingdom. Rule with love, not fear." "I will," Theron promised, his voice rough with emotion. Michelle's gaze turned to me one final time. "Thank you," she said. "For showing me that it's never too late to choose differently. For helping me remember who I was before the pain changed me." "Thank you," I replied, "for showing me what true sacrifice looks like." She nodded, peace settling over her features like a soft blanket. "I can see him," she said wonderingly. "Marcus. He's here, and he's proud of me. He says the poetry he's written while he was waiting is much better now." She laughed, a sound like silver bells, and then she was gone. Not with violence or drama, but simply fading away like morning mist touched by sunlight. The last expression on her face was pure joy. For a moment, the throne room was completely silent. Then Theron stood and pulled me into his arms, holding me tight as we both processed what had just happened. "She's free," he said quietly. "Finally free." "We all are," I replied, feeling the truth of it settle into my bones. "The curse is broken. The realm is healed. People can simply be people again." We held each other in the gathering darkness, listening to the sounds of a kingdom awakening from a long nightmare. Already I could hear differences, laughter that sounded genuine, conversations that lacked the sharp edge of supernatural irritation, children playing with carefree abandon. Chapter 11, The New Dawn. 3 days after Michelle's sacrifice, the transformation of the Northern Realm was nothing short of miraculous. Where once the Citadel had been a place of whispered fears and carefully controlled emotions, it now buzzed with genuine life and energy. The great hall that had once echoed with the lonely sound of a tormented king's footsteps now rang with music and laughter as we hosted delegations from across the continent. I stood at the window of our private chambers. Theron had insisted I move into the royal suite within days of our engagement, watching the sun set over mountains that no longer seemed threatening but protective. The landscape that had once felt oppressive with supernatural weight now seemed to glow with natural beauty. "The representatives from the Eastern Territories have arrived," Theron said, entering the room and wrapping his arms around me from behind. "They're eager to learn about our healing methods. Apparently, they've heard rumors about the Miracle Queen, who can cure despair with a touch." I leaned back against his chest, still marveling at how perfectly I fit against him. "I wish they wouldn't call me that. It makes it sound like magic, when really it's just understanding." "Don't underestimate what you've accomplished," he said, pressing a kiss to the top of my head. "In 3 days, you've helped establish healing protocols that are already being implemented in 6 territories. You've shown people that empathic abilities are gifts to be celebrated, not hidden. You've literally changed the world." It was true. Word of the great healing had spread like wildfire. Leaders from distant lands were arriving daily, not seeking aid for supernatural afflictions, but wanting to learn how to create societies where emotional wellness was valued alongside physical strength. "The wedding preparations are coming along well," Theron continued, his voice growing warmer. "Though I still think we should have a smaller ceremony." I turned in his arms to face him. "And disappoint all those people who want to celebrate the end of the sorrowing? I don't think so. This wedding isn't just about us, it's about hope. It's about showing the world that love really can triumph over fear." "When did you become so wise?" he asked, smiling down at me. "When I started listening to a very smart king who taught me that sometimes the personal is political," I replied. "Besides, I want everyone to see how proud I am to be yours." Before he could respond, a soft knock interrupted us. "Come in," Theron called. Captain Hayes entered, his weathered face creased with the kind of smile that had become common throughout the Citadel. "Your Majesties, forgive the interruption, but there's someone here to see you. Someone I think you'll want to meet." Curious, we followed him to a small receiving room where a young woman waited nervously. She was perhaps 19, with the kind of clear eyes I recognized, someone who had discovered their gift and learned to use it constructively. "Your Majesties," she said, curtsying gracefully. "My name is Elena. I've come from the Western Reaches. I have abilities like Lady Kayla's. I can sense emotions and sometimes help ease distress. But more than that, I can help people process their feelings, understand them better." I stepped forward, automatically extending my empathic senses. The girl radiated a familiar combination of confidence and purpose, emotions I now associated with empaths who had learned to see their abilities as gifts rather than burdens. How did you discover your abilities? I asked gently. I've always had them, but I thought they were normal until the healing wave came, she said, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. When that happened, something changed. I stopped absorbing everyone's emotions automatically. I could choose when to help and when to protect myself. And I realized I could do more than just take pain away. I could help people understand it, learn from it. This was exactly what I had hoped would happen. Michelle's sacrifice hadn't just ended the sorrowing, it had awakened and stabilized empathic abilities in people across the continent, giving them the tools they needed to use their gifts constructively. I want to learn, Elena continued. I want to help establish healing centers in other territories, teach people that their emotions aren't something to be feared or suppressed, but understood and honored. I looked at Theron, seeing my own excitement reflected in his eyes. This was the future we had envisioned, not just healing the damage the sorrowing had caused, but building something better in its place. Of course, I said. But first, tell me, what drives you? What makes you want to help others? Elena's expression grew thoughtful. Because I know what it's like to feel like you're drowning in other people's pain, to think there's something wrong with you for feeling so much. If I can help even one person understand that sensitivity is a strength, not a weakness. She shrugged. Then maybe all the confusion and fear I experienced will have been worth something. Over the following days, Elena became the first in what would eventually become a network of trained empaths spanning the continent. Other young people arrived almost daily, some sent by leaders who had heard about our work, others coming on their own after discovering their abilities during the Great Healing. Each new arrival brought their own story and their own unique way of experiencing emotions. There was Marcus, who could sense the difference between truth and deception. Sarah, who could help people release trauma stored in their bodies. David, who specialized in helping families understand each other better. All of them had learned to see their abilities not as curses to be hidden, but as tools for healing and connection. You're building something revolutionary, Theron observed one evening as we watched a group of empaths practicing techniques in the garden. A generation of healers who understand that emotional pain isn't something to be endured alone. We're building it, I corrected. This only works because you're creating the legal and political framework to support it. The laws protecting empaths, the funding for training centers, the cultural shift that values emotional intelligence alongside other forms of strength. It was true. While I focused on training and direct healing work, Theron had been systematically changing the structures that had once marginalized people like me. Empaths could no longer be discriminated against or forced to use their abilities against their will. They were recognized as valuable contributors to society, with rights and protections written into law. Speaking of building things, Theron said, his voice taking on a familiar warm tone, I have something to show you. He led me to a section of the citadel I rarely visited, opening a door to reveal a suite of rooms that took my breath away. They were filled with natural light from tall windows, decorated in soft blues and greens that spoke of peace and growth. The furniture was comfortable but practical, designed for both intimate conversations and larger group sessions. What is this? I asked, though I was beginning to suspect. Your official chambers, he said. Not as my queen, though you'll have those too, of course, but as the royal empath. The formal recognition of your role as the kingdom's premier expert on emotional healing. I walked through the rooms, taking in details that showed how much thought he'd put into this. A library stocked with texts on empathic theory. A private garden for meditation and reflection. Treatment rooms designed for both individual and group work. Theron, this is incredible, I breathed. But you didn't need to. Yes, I did, he said firmly. The work you're doing is too important to be treated as a hobby or a side project. This makes it official. This makes you not just my queen, but a ruler in your own right, with your own domain of expertise. I turned to find him watching me with an expression of such love and pride it made my chest tight. Have I told you lately that I love you? Not in the last hour, he said with a grin. I was starting to worry. I laughed and threw my arms around his neck, kissing him with all the gratitude and love I couldn't put into words. When we finally broke apart, I rested my forehead against his. When I was rejected, when I was sold, when I thought my life was over, I said softly, I never could have imagined this. Not just finding love, but finding purpose. Finding a way to transform the worst thing that ever happened to me into the best thing I could do for others. That's what love does, Theron replied. It transforms everything it touches. You transformed me, I transformed you, and together we've helped transform a kingdom. 2 weeks later, we stood before the great doors of the citadel, preparing for our wedding ceremony. I wore a gown of ivory silk with silver embroidery that caught the morning light, and the crown Theron had commissioned for me, not a circlet this time, but a true crown that marked me as his equal. Are you ready? He asked, offering me his arm. I looked out at the crowd gathered in the courtyard, not just nobles and dignitaries, but common people from across the realm. Farmers and merchants, healers and warriors, empaths and those they'd helped. All of them here to celebrate not just our union, but what it represented. Among them, I spotted some familiar faces. Elena and the other empaths, now wearing the blue and silver sashes that marked them as official healers. Captain Hayes and his guards, grinning with pride. Even some representatives from the Silvermane pack, including, to my surprise, Lysander himself, his face peaceful in a way I'd never seen before. But it was the children who made my heart swell the most. They ran freely through the crowd, laughing and playing without the shadow of supernatural fear that had once hung over everything. They would grow up in a world where empathy was valued, where emotional strength was as important as physical power, where being different was seen as a gift rather than a burden. Yes, I said, squeezing Theron's arm. I'm ready. As the great doors opened and we walked forward together into our new life, I felt a presence beside me that had nothing to do with the physical world. Michelle, walking with us in spirit, her sacrifice transformed into the foundation of everything we were building. Thank you, I thought to her. For choosing love in the end. For showing me what true strength looks like. And though she couldn't answer, I could swear I felt her blessing, warm and approving, as we stepped into the sunlight of a world reborn. The treasure's worth. 5 years later. I stood in the garden behind the citadel, watching my 3-year-old daughter Lyra chase butterflies with the same fierce determination she applied to everything else in her small world. She had Theron's silver eyes and my empathic abilities, but her personality was entirely her own, bold, curious, and utterly fearless. Mama, look, she called out, cupping something gently in her hands. It's sad. I walked over to see what she'd found, a small bird with an injured wing. Even at 3, Lyra could sense its distress and wanted to help. It was a gift I'd learned to guide rather than suppress, teaching her early that her abilities were something to be proud of. Let's take it to Healer Marcus, I suggested. He'll know how to help. Marcus, not the warrior from my old pack, but the young empath who had become our resident expert in healing animals as well as people, had established a small clinic in the village below the citadel. It was one of dozens of healing centers now operating across the continent, all staffed by empaths who had learned to use their gifts constructively. As we walked toward the clinic, Lyra chattering happily about the bird and how we were going.
You've been listening to The Thorned Crown, here on Romance Chronicles. If this story captured your heart, then subscribe to the channel and tap the bell. That's how you'll never miss your next epic romance. Want to share this journey with a friend who loves fated mates and alpha heroes as much as you do? Share this video and get lost in the story together. We live for your reactions. Tell us in the comments, who was your favorite character? Until the next chronicle, I'm Georgina. Thank you for listening.